Hello, and welcome to Robbinsdale Revisited. I'm Pete Ritchie, the president of the Robbinsdale Historical Society. Today we're focusing on 5 remarkable women, the daughters of Andrew B. Robbins, whose lives helped shape the story of Robbinsdale. This episode draws on the work of Robert B. Porter, and while we begin by focusing on the family estate, we soon turn our attention to the sisters themselves, Edith, Amy, Adelaide, Ruth, and Esther. Each of them was highly educated, attending the University of Minnesota at a time when that alone set them apart. But they didn't stop there. They became musicians, writers, teachers, and leaders in their community. Adelaide was a poet and musician known for her creativity and love of language. Amy pushed even further, serving overseas during World War I, working in radio communications, and later becoming a leader in civic and veterans organizations. Edith dedicated her life to education, serving for decades on the Robbinsdale School Board and helping shape local schools. Ruth's story is quieter, but marked by resilience through personal loss and continued involvement in civic life. And Esther, the youngest, stood out for her independence and spirit. She left behind letters and family records that give us some of the clearest insight into all their lives. Together, these 5 women lived full and complex lives, far beyond what was typically expected of them at the time. They didn't just grow up in Robbinsdale, they helped define it. Join me and Crystal Boyd as we explore the lives of the Robbins sisters. So back in the 1890s, the Robbins family had decided to build a house on what would become part of their development, Robbinsdale Park. Andrew B. Robbins chose 20 acres overlooking Twin Lake on the west side of the lake, about where Highway 100 crosses it now. He built this fantastic house. It had 16 rooms. It was a palatial mansion with turrets and porches and breezeways and dormers, stained glass windows, polished woodwork and fireplaces. There was a grand piano and a huge library filled with hundreds of books, 5 fireplaces to help keep out the winter cold, indoor plumbing. There were 8 acres of lawns and walks and fountains and shrubs. Mrs. Robbins, Adelaide Robbins, was very busy as a gardener and grew rare flowers. There was a natural pond fed by an underground spring. This was the domain of the Robbins family. Property became known as the Orchards because it was a horticultural showplace. Mrs. Robbins was an expert with flowers. Many of the seeds came from the plants that she grew in her own garden, and she had a little conservatory that was connected to the dining room. And each spring she studied the seed catalogs for long hours before sending off for new and exotic plants. And she knew the Latin names of every plant she grew. And we have this letter to the editor from a Robbins daughter, but we don't know which one.
An artesian well ran constantly into a trough by the pasture gate, so the beautiful soft, tan, and brown Jersey cows always had cold water to drink. The well drained into the lake, and all along the banks grew marigolds, watercress, and myriads of violets. Mother planted forget-me-nots brought from Germany. They were a mass of blooms all summer. There were every known kind of violet, yellow violets and small white fragrant ones, and the larger white ones. Jack in the pulpit grew large in the deep shade. A catalpa tree filled the air with fragrance in the spring of the year, as did canary bird trees with their fronds of yellow blossoms. A big weeping willow by the lake added its graceful beauty, as did the white curl-leaf birch, oaks, and elms. No more ideal place could ever be found in which to bring up a family. How I loved it all.
I love a catalpa tree in the spring. Years later, Jan Baldwin Norden, a former Robbinsdale resident, recalled sneaking into the old Robbins mansion long after it had been deserted. We never disturbed or took anything, just looked. I'm sure others also went in because as time went by, the house became a mess, and we would find empty cans of food and bottles in the basement. It might have been a refuge for transients. The attic had trunks filled with long gowns, hats, papers, and books. There was china cabinets filled with beautiful dishes and crystal. Lovely velvet drapes covered the windows. Victorian furniture graced every room. It was as though the family walked away and left all the furnishings. That was from the 1940s, just before the mansion was torn down. And there's an unidentified clipping from 1898 another glimpse into the Robbins estate and the Robbins family. The news article described the activities of the Minneapolis Tourist Club that was active between 1891 and 1965.
The Tourist Club held its midsummer picnic yesterday at the beautiful suburban home of Mrs. A.B. Robbins of Robbinsdale. The guests were met at the end of the streetcar line by carriages, which carried them to their hostess's residence. The house was adorned with a profusion of garden flowers, and the grounds were as lovely as the sky cleared. Luncheon was served at 1 o'clock in the dining room and on the west side veranda. The tables were decorated with roses, and a rose lay at each plate. The hostess's 5 beautiful daughters assisted in the hospitable duties of the occasion. The midsummer picnics at Robbinsdale are always marked by something clever in the form of entertainment, but nothing more clever was ever given than the dramatic production at 4 o'clock, which closed a delightful day. A stage had been placed in the dining room, and polite ushers seated the guests and provided them with unique programs having on them an insignia of American and Cuban flags and the American eagle. The cover announced the play as All's a Sell, a Turio-comic tragedy in 3 acts. Realism was carried to great lengths, the ushers passing through the audience crying opera glasses, in a very natural way, and the stage carpenters made things interesting behind the curtain as they changed the scenery from scene 1 to scene 2 and last scene. The comedy was presented by Adelaide, Amy, Edith, Ruth, and Esther Robbins.
And so there we have the first time that we've mentioned the names of all 5 daughters.
Now, 56 years old, Andrew B. Robbins may have felt he had earned the right to slow down to devote more time to his growing family, because by 1901 he had a house full of unmarried young women and a yard full of suitors. The oldest daughter, Edith, was 30 years old, Amy was age 23, Adelaide was 20, Ruth 15, and baby Esther had just turned 12. There's a little quote from Esther. She says, Edith, Ruth, and Esther, that's me, had brown hair and eyes, and Adelaide and Amy had gorgeous heavy blonde hair and big blue eyes. Their braids reached their waists.
The blue eyes are obvious when I look at these pictures. Again, we're using Robert B. Porter's book here. One of the things he does is he asks some questions. Were their parents strict or authoritarian? It's really hard to tell. You can tell that they loved their parents. They wrote poems about their parents. They admired their parents. They thought it was really important to carry on their father's legacy. They were proud of having the town named after their family. They appeared in these sort of who's who of Minnesota women, and they would give these long descriptions of all their accomplishments and how important their family was and how prosperous their family was and how influential their father was, and he was a state senator and this village is named after him. I have a feeling that their parents were really kind. They valued education. They made sure that each one of these girls went to the University of Minnesota. They were taught to play musical instruments. I think of their household as Downton Abbey. I bet they came to dinner dressed up. I know they had domestics. There was probably a maid's quarters somewhere in that giant place.
Well, Porter says, who can blame a mother and father for being excited when the first of several daughters was wed? Adelaide became the first bride. She had been born April 1st, 1881, and was 22 years old when she married. The city newspapers announced that Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Bonnie Robbins had issued invitations for the marriage of their daughter Adelaide to Ralph Perkins Gillette. The society page informed readers about a bridal shower planned for the bride at the Gillette home in Minnetonka after a luncheon aboard the family launch. Subsequent editions kept the public informed of a succession of social engagements preceding the wedding, which was planned for the evening of June 23, 1903. It would be at the family residence in Robbinsdale. They talk a little bit about the wedding. So finally the day arrived and the handsome country home was glowing with light and the decorations were arranged with artistic effect. Special mention was made that Miss Amy Robbins played the wedding march on her violin. A persistent rumor exists to this day that Mr. Robbins had some kind of unsurfaced street sprinkled with water to hold down the dust.
Was it oil or just water, or who knows?
But alas, after a few years, tragedy intervened. On a hot July afternoon, Ralph P. Gillette, while playing golf at Interlaken, sought shelter from the approaching storm under a large tree and was struck by a bolt of lightning. The funeral was held in the home of his father, L.S. Gillette, owner of Minneapolis Steel and Machinery Company. Survivors included his wife and an 8-year-old son, Louis Robbins Gillette. Well, when Adelaide died on July 25th, 1965, she was survived by a grandson, Louis R. Gillette, according to her obituary in the Minneapolis Tribune. She lived in Laguna Beach, California, but no son bearing the same name was listed in her obituary. So one has to wonder if the writer of the obituary accidentally substituted grandson for son. Louis Robbins Gillette had a Minnesota birth certificate listing June 15th, 1904 as his date of birth. So all you genealogists out there, if you want to track him down, let us know.
There's not that many children in the next generation. Most of these women don't have children.
Adelaide spent part of her life living in Edina, Minnesota, and died at the age of 84. She had studied violin, pianoforte, and vocal music. At the University of Minnesota, she had specialized in philosophy and psychology, and as a graduate student earned acclaim for several pamphlets written about the psychology of music. Adelaide was fluent in German, French, and Italian, and was a member of Hennepin Avenue Methodist Church in Minneapolis.
Among the memorials of this lady are 2 small books of poetry, and I've looked these up on Amazon. They're still out there. One of them is called Interval, and the other one is called Afterglow, and she had them published in 1931. We have a little poem. When the sunset brings the afterglow, bright little windows, row on row, all seem to burn with inward light, then pitilessly falls the night. And of course, she's not the only published poet. As we go further, you'll see that most of the women published things. We'll see what Robert B. Porter has to say about Amy Robbins here.
And the interesting thing is that he's organizing these ladies by when they were married. So he says, the year 1907 was a parent's delight or a father's nightmare, depending upon your point of view. 3 of the Robbins daughters were married that summer. 29-year-old Amy Irene Robbins, who on August 14th married John J. Rowland Ware, her college beau. Amy, who had played the wedding march at her sister Adelaide's wedding 4 years earlier, who had graduated from East High School in 1896 and the University of Minnesota in 1901, married one of her university classmates. Amy had been born September 7, 1877, allegedly at the Minneapolis home of Thomas Barlow Walker. Well, Miss Amy's literary reputation was well known. The class play at the University of Minnesota, When Bugles Blow, was likely inspired by Civil War stories told by Amy's father. Amy was one of the co-authors of this production, along with fellow students Margaret Moore and George N. Northrup. The 1901 dramatic rendition received rave ratings from critics. Amy in 1901 received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture and in 1906 a Master of Arts degree.
And later on, she's going to put that degree in architecture to work when they brought in developers and got houses built on her father's land, and she was working with Edith and the real estate company. She knew some of these housing designs, and they had taken an old house that was on West Broadway, and they went to the quarry and they picked out stones, and they built walls around the house with stone walls, giant fireplaces, and that house stood until the 1970s.
Well, she was so artistic. I mean, from the age of 8, she had begun to show an inclination toward playing the violin. She later became a teacher of that instrument. On August 14th, 1907, Amy and Ware were married at the Robbins home in Robbinsdale. Jessie Ware, sister of the groom, played the wedding march. The whole bow window in the parlor was canopied with vines and banked with ferns and palms. We don't know what happened to Mr. Ware, but he is not buried in the Robbins family plot at Lakewood Cemetery along with Amy. Reportedly, they had no children and were divorced.
I did figure out later that he remarried. In 1913 and part of 1914, Amy accompanied her mother, her sister Ruth, Ruth's husband, Dr. Fred Rhoda, her sister Adelaide Gillette, and son Louis, and a cousin, Ann Walker, to Europe on a tour. While they were there, hostilities between countries were already beginning.
Well, in April, on April 6th, 1917, and that's the day the U.S. entered World War I, Amy enrolled in the American School of Telegraphy to learn Morse code and radio technology. For a while, she trained women radio operators until joining the American Red Cross and volunteering for duty at the war front in France. The radio operators were necessary to sustain a communications network for the overseas military operation. And that's quite a commitment to go overseas and participate in something like that.
I think she started here at Fort Snelling, and there is a letter about her leaving on a boat, and we know the name of the boat because the letterhead has the boat on it. And then there is a letter from her mother to T.B. Walker about her leaving on this expedition, and Walker says she's going there on a steamer? I would have thought she would have paddled her own canoe.
Well, and she came from this long line of strong and patriotic women, right? So
Mhm.
when she was on her way to France, some examples came from her mother and grandmother, both of whom became army nurses in times of crisis. So she's following in the lead of these women who came before her of helping out when there's a violent
Yeah,
conflict.
I knew her mother did, because her mother was a nurse in the Civil War. What would her grandmother have done? The War of 1812, Mexican-American War?
Amy composed the following verses in 1918 while aboard the troop ship in New York Harbor, waiting to begin a voyage to the war front. And this poem is called Echoes of France. Because the memory of my soldier father is so vivid to me, and years ago his only son passed on to the far country, because in Tripler Hospital my mother lent her youthful strength for 2 years in the awful havoc of our own Civil War, and has stood by me to the very moment of my sailing, because my sisters are the staunchest champions unfailing, and I have a friend most wonderful, because I feel the urge today of generations of Americans who will not let me stay. I have this night started in the voyage, so fraught with chance, I hope will carry me across the darkened, mine-strewn sea to France.
Rhyming just is, it's still nice.
It is. Well, and that imagery of mine-strewn sea to France,
Mhm.
just think about heading out in a boat into the dark night, this vast ocean full of mines that could blow up at any time. It's terrifying.
Yep. And German submarines.
Well, she remained on duty until December 8th, 1918, and was honorably discharged from the Army Educational Corps at New York City on June 14th, 1919. She returned safely from her adventures in France and then spent several years as a radio instructor at the Army School at Fort Snelling in Minnesota. Later, she and her sister Edith started a business in downtown Robbinsdale called the Highway Tea House.
Yeah, and that's the building I was talking about before, where they went and picked out the stones from the quarry to build the wall and to build the chimneys.
And she stayed active, so in civilian life, she participated in the General Federation of Women's Clubs and held national offices. The Minnesota Federation of Women's Clubs was established through the work of the Minneapolis Tourist Club, which her family had been a part of. This was an organization in which Amy was elected its president in 1923. A newspaper article in the Minneapolis Journal on March 25th, 1923, said that the goal of the Tourist Club was to prepare women for intelligent travel and all that interests an observant tourist.
And another thing that she did is she became the vice commander of the VFW in Minnesota. She had to fight a little bit because she was a veteran. She was entitled to certain benefits, and she's writing letters back and forth to Washington and to the VFW, and the VFW was not supporting her as a veteran, and she was not going to have that. And there's all of these letters that begin with, "Dear Sir, I am a veteran of the United States military. I am entitled to." So she fought for that and headed up the VFW for a while.
President Warren G. Harding commended Amy for producing a brochure called The Permanent Court of International Justice as the first step toward the prevention of war. Amy was a helpful member of the Hennepin County Republican Speakers Bureau and later gave radio talks about preventing war for the League of Women Voters. She also belonged to the Maine Society of Descendants of the Mayflower, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Women's Overseas League, and the Business Women's Club of Minneapolis. She held elected office in several of these organizations, so she really continued on and used her leadership skills. And she died unexpectedly at Abbott Hospital in Minneapolis on May 5th, 1929, at the age of 51 from a cerebral hemorrhage.
That cut a lot of things short. The newspapers were talking about her running for Congress. Ruth is actually the daughter that I know the very least about.
Less than 1 month after Amy's wedding, her sister Ruth walked down the same aisle. She married Fled Sterling Loomis. The Reverend S.J. Rogers was there in the same beautifully decorated home to read the service of marriage before the happy couple. And after they were married, they moved to Eureka, Montana. The Society News and the city newspapers said that Ruth had chosen her sister Esther to be her maid of honor. And the quote is that it will be a quiet wedding with only 60 guests invited, the newspaper reported. So Ruth was 21 when she was married, which is a younger age than any of her sisters. She was born about 1886 with brown hair and eyes. She favored her mother's side more than her father's side of the family. Ruth joined Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis along with other family members in 1906. And the following spring, she graduated from the University of Minnesota. But 1 year and 3 months after the wedding, Sterling Loomis died unexpectedly at their home. And that was when they were in Montana. He had had an illness for only about 4 days. And unfortunately, Ruth was off visiting at the time, probably here in Robbinsdale. And her husband Loomis was attended by his brother, Dr. E.S. Loomis, but to no avail. Sometime following 1910, Ruth Robbins Loomis married Dr. Frederick C. Rhoda, a pediatrician.
And then we just have this little clipping here. Doctor's widow dies, Minneapolis Star, March 17th, 1971. Miss Ruth Rhoda, 38 Summit Place, died Tuesday. Ms. Rhoda was a former president of the American Association of University Women and the widow of the late Frederick Rhoda, a Minneapolis pediatrician. Among survivors were a niece, Miss Willis Walling, and a nephew, Louis R. Gillette. So there's Louis R. Gillette peeking out again. We still don't know what happened to him. In 1957, Ruth transferred her church membership from Westminster Presbyterian Church to the Colonial Congregational Church in Edina. Ruth died on St. Patrick's Day, March 16th, in 1971. Well, now we get to another daughter. It's Edith. And now she's going to get married.
So back to the year 1907, because one more Robbins wedding was scheduled for that memorable fall. Edith Austin Robbins was married in October 1907 to Thomas Lester Daniel. She was a matronly 36 at the time of her marriage.
She's practically an old maid.
I mean, not that we're judging, but okay, so she was 36 when she was married. She was born July 20th, 1871, and was definitely older than any of her sisters when they were married. She lived a long life with a fulfilling career, but nothing more is heard about her husband, leading one to suspect that he did not live for many more years. There's a little note that keeping husbands alive seemed to be a family problem. These poor ladies. But he might have died in 1939.
He might have.
But just after Edith's graduation from high school, Mrs. Andrew Robbins and her 18-year-old daughter Edith visited Europe. On the return trip, their ship, the steamer City of Rome, collided with an iceberg in mid-ocean.
Titanic.
It's terrifying.
Yep.
They said, "We were just 4 days out of Glasgow." That's what the mother wrote. "When we ran into a dense fog, it was like running into a snowbank. We had just gone into dinner when the prow of the ship shot suddenly into the air, trembled from stern to stern, and careened far over on its side. One man was rendered insane by the traumatic event."
So that she makes it home somehow.
And when she gets back, she's going to college. She spent her early college years at Macalester and Carleton, but earned a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Minnesota in 1899 and a Master of Arts degree 2 years later. She was the teacher in the family. Edith taught in Robbinsdale grade schools, Madelia, Minnesota High School, and Central and East High Schools in Minneapolis. She taught Latin, mathematics, and English in Minneapolis and became a principal there. She also served on the Robbinsdale School Board for 24 years. In fact, her re-election in July 1923 was said to be the largest vote ever polled in Robbinsdale for school director.
Who'd have thunk it? And she appears in pictures of the school board, and it's interesting, in the very first few Robbinsdale high school yearbooks, they put the pictures of the school board, and she's in those pictures too. She was instrumental in securing government funds to build the high school in 1936, and so there's pictures of her placing a time capsule into the wall with the rest of the school board. She was very proud of what she could do for the Robbinsdale Public Schools.
And she does more than just being a teacher, which is a lot, more than just being involved in education. She also became an accomplished pianist under the tutelage of Carl V. Lachmond, who later became director of the Schwarwenka Conservatory of Music in New York City.
Oh, goodness.
She did civic affairs, so she was an active member of the Tourist Club of Minneapolis and was elected its secretary. And the church was important in her life. She became superintendent at the old Robbinsdale Congregational Church and helped them establish the Christian Endeavor Society. She and her adopted daughter, Helen Mary Daniel, were members of that church. She's also a businesswoman, so she and her sister Amy owned and operated the Highway Tea House in Robbinsdale for many years. Plus, they were into real estate, insurance, and money lending through the Robbinsdale Insurance and Loan Agency, which was at 4223 Crystal Lake Avenue. and it seemed only right that they would handle the financial affairs of their father, Andrew B. Robbins, after his death.
And so that building again is the Highway Tea House. It was her office, and Crystal Lake Avenue later becomes West Broadway. There's a funeral home there now, and I know that building survived up into the 1970s. So Andrew B. Robbins made Edith the executrix, and I just love that word, the executrix of his estate. So she was in charge of the business dealings. She brings her sister in to help, but she's running the business now. The loans, the real estate. He probably had some other little business interests going. Oh, here we have our phone numbers.
We had her phone numbers.
Yeah, found in an outdated black book of telephone numbers once carried by T.B. Walker are Robbins, Mrs. A.B., Highland 0062, and the Tea House, which is at Highland 0884.
And she was so busy. In 1920, this company, Gin and Company from Boston, who published school textbooks, reached out and asked if Edith would help to prepare a series of music textbooks, because remember, she'd done all that training with the piano.
Mm-hmm.
And after several trips to Boston and consultations with Thaddeus Giddings, the director of music in Minneapolis Public Schools, at least 4 textbooks were published. As is typical, however, Edith didn't seem to rate much credit, although she often chose to use pen names containing Robbins, Barlow, or Walker.
And we've got a couple of these little books in our files here at the Historical Society. They're generally like pamphlets and little readers just to help people get going and learn how to read. And one of these textbooks, supposedly written with the help of Edith, contains sage advice to music teachers. These suggestions may still apply.
And there's 4 of them. They suggest do not repeat statements. Let the pupils understand that they must listen the first time. Assume that the pupils have common sense. Allow the pupils to develop their own reasoning power. Do not tell children things which they can just discover for themselves. And let the motto of the music lessons be less talking, more singing, less teaching, more learning.
Edith Daniel died on August 4th, 1944, about a month after being struck by a car as she crossed the street. It was perhaps appropriate that she was returning home from a school board meeting after having been elected to her 24th year on the august body of the Robbinsdale Public School Board. She was 73 at the time of her death, and a local newspaper published an especially long tribute to her. In the tribute was a verse from her poem, A Child's Land Out of Doors. It seems as a fitting epitaph for her life.
The lovely land of out of doors, the end the children know, is filled with all the happy things that sing and bloom and grow.
That brings us to Esther Robbins.
Last but not least, Esther Mary Robbins was another of the girls with brown hair and eyes like their mother. She was born June 26, 1889, and grew up in the orchards of Robbinsdale. Interestingly, Esther joined Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis by confession, that is, publicly accepting Christ at age 13. As a teenager, perhaps relatives encouraged her to become part of this congregation. We know that it was not someone from her immediate family because they weren't members until later. Esther was bright and talented. She transferred to East High School for 8th grade because her sister Edith was teaching there. Then when Edith went to West High School, Edith transferred to that location. Esther, by her own description, grew up feeling sorry for her father because he had 5 daughters but no surviving sons. By her own admission, she tried to fill the role of son as best as she could. She had nightshirts made like his, hated frills and ruffles, and my curls. She climbed every tree and roof and loved the platform on top of the windmill.
Yep, and we have these pictures of the Robbins mansion, and behind it is a really big windmill, and it was taller than the house. She did manage to scamper quite a ways.
So she'd get up there and do her dad proud. She also loved school and proudly recounted how she gave an original paper, The Diary of a Dog, at her 8th grade graduation. During high school, she maintained an average of 92% and was asked to present foolish notions at the high school graduation exercises. Within the next few years, she purchased her own grand piano, which she kept at home, and she had it insured for $1,000. We can assume that she had graduated from the University of Minnesota by the time her father died. 1 year later, in 1911, she married William Wright Scott on the 25th day of April. For the wedding, the performance was to be at high noon in the music room where a chancel was formed in palms, white roses, and huge cathedral candles. Little Louis Robbins Gillette, a nephew of Esther's, was to be the ring bearer. After the ceremony, a reception for 400 was held in the Orchards, the Robbins home.
They must have been out on the lawn. So
That's a lot of people. Her husband, William W. Scott, was a well-known insurance agent and founded the Lincoln National Life Insurance Agency in Minneapolis. He died on June 30th, 1952, at age 63. Esther Robbins Scott died September 10th, 1961, at age 72. One difference between Esther and her sisters is that she left a long line of descendants. Her daughter, Andrea Bonnie Scott, married Willis Lampert Walling and raised 4 children, who were Andrea Bonnie Walling, Wendy Lampert Walling, Phoebe Rhoda Walling, and Wright Scott Walling. Several of the children remained in Minneapolis to raise their own families. One of them, Wright Walling, is a prominent Minneapolis attorney.
Wright Walling came out to visit us at the Historical Society when this box of Esther's letters turned up in Plymouth. He had no idea. He did remember that his mother was in a townhome out there for a short time, but she left a giant box that included letters from A.B. Robbins, letters from Adelaide Robbins, her courtship letters, letters from Amy Robbins. All the notes for Amy Robbins' book, Echoes of France, are in that box of letters. A few little pictures, a picture of her dressed up as Dolly Madison, sitting with an old colonial flag. There's a picture of her and her dogs, and then the paper Diary of a Dog that is mentioned in this little reading is also in that box. And we can briefly mention that the Adelaide and Andrew had a couple other children that didn't make it. They were Harlow and Helen Robbins, and that was his only son, and neither one of them, survived very many years of childhood. We talked about the 5 daughters of Andrew B. Robbins and Adelaide Robbins, and I think we'll probably spend the next few episodes going into more detail about these women's lives, everything we can find. They were such influential women in the history of Robbinsdale. They affected our politics, the way the streets were laid out, the way the neighborhoods evolved, and there's just so much material.
Thanks for listening. I'm Crystal Boyd. Robbinsdale Revisited is brought to you by the Robbinsdale Historical Society. Our little history museum is located at 4915 42nd Avenue North in the heart of Robbinsdale. We're open Fridays and Saturdays from 10 to 3. You can also visit us online at robbinsdale.org. You found this episode, so you know where to find the next one.
Bicycle into the city every Saturday to see our friends. Bus back home, sitting hand in hand when the evening ends. Oh, when the evening ends. Oh, when the evening ends in Robbinsdale. In Robbinsdale.
Our theme music is provided by Gabe Barnett and Them Rounders.